Hello again, and today we're going to talk about the classical Hollywood narrative and a couple of variations of the same. This is from chapter 4 in your textbook on narrative. And taking a look at chapter 4, you will find a chart that looks an awful lot like this. And basically, what this does is describe the classical Hollywood narrative and other forms of literature as well. So you'll find this sometimes in novels, sometimes in plays, and so on. But basically, think of it as a three-act play with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And broken down a bit more carefully with the white line into various actions. So exposition, conflict, rising action, the climax, falling action, and the resolution, which we see a little more fully fleshed out in this slide, which talks about what you can expect to find specifically in each aspect of the classical Hollywood narrative. And so in the first exposition, I'm going to call it the setup. And the setup is basically going to introduce you to the setting where it's taking place. It's going to set up the characters. Who's going to be our protagonist? Who's going to be the villain, the antagonist? It's going to give us conflicts and goals. Sometimes each character, protagonist and antagonist, will have different goals, often at odds with each other. But I want to move to the question of the protagonist. And protagonist is basically a hero. And the protagonist may begin like Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker and Katniss from humble origins. But they have qualities that we tend to admire, like humility and gratitude, and they're willing to risk their lives for their ideals. And so good people. On the other hand, we have the antagonist, which is oftentimes called the villain, although sometimes our sympathies are thrown that way. I'm thinking specifically of the Joker a bit, but the antagonist tends to have qualities that we don't like destroy the world or take over the universe or whatever it might be. And in the case of the Joker, of course, the idea was just anarchy, chaos. Of course, I'm leaving out a very important villain, which is the Wizard of Oz. And I want to quickly talk about the setup for the Wizard of Oz. And so the film came out in 1939. Story was well known. There were a couple of silent versions, and there were plays of this. The book was a bestseller. And the film begins in a kind of sepia, brownish toned black and white prelude or setup that introduces the setting, a farm, in a really desolate area, right? There's no leaves on the trees. It's all very barren. The three farm workers are kind of trying to repair this dilapidated wagon. I mean, there's a sense of poverty here, and there's a sense of want. And so it's not surprising that Dorothy yearns for more, then sings a song about Somewhere Over the Rainbow, amongst others. And so here's a person who's kind. She has a dog that she loves. She lives with her aunt and uncle, and there's clearly a loving relationship, although that's about to be shattered by this person, Mrs. Gulch, who is going to ride her bicycle to the Gale farm and talk with the parents of Dorothy, accusing Toto the dog of having bitten her cat and therefore worthy of being taken away to be euthanized. That's pretty heavy. So the parents, or the aunt and uncle, agree. And so Mrs. Gulch rides off with Toto in the back basket of her bicycle, but had forgotten to latch the back so that Toto is able to escape, become reunited with Dorothy, and they decide, you know what, this is not our world. And so they decide, or at least Dorothy decides for them, to run away. And again, you get this sense from this image of this world and why anybody would want to escape. Nothing is growing here. It's kind of post-apocalyptic, really. But it also nicely, and we'll talk about this when we get into mise-en-scène, kind of sets an emotional tone. In Dorothy's travels, she runs into Professor Marvel, who is kind of a huckster who pretends to tell the future, and he advises Dorothy, who agrees to go back home. And so she does, but unfortunately at a time when there's a tornado ripping through Kansas. Again, this is a really inhospitable world. The rest of the family has already gone and locked themselves up in the shelter, and Dorothy can't gain entrance, so she runs into the house, into her bedroom, and is hit by a window as the tornado rips up her house and flies it away. And it lands, finally, this image, of course, isn't actually from the film. It's kind of a combination of two images from the film, Oz. And so we're now at the point where we've set it up really pretty nicely. We know who the protagonist is, Dorothy. We know who the antagonist is, and here the antagonist, Mrs. Gulch, has been transformed into the Wicked Witch of the East. And interestingly, it's possible you could say that we've kind of reached the end, too, of Dorothy's first goal, to go somewhere over the rainbow. And so this is a place of color and so forth. But as you'll see, very vivid color, I might add, very shortly, we'll see that Dorothy is going to get another goal, which is to get back home. So this first part of the narrative can really be quite short. In the case of Wizard of Oz, it's a relatively lengthy 15-20 minute segment, and in some films you can have dispensed with it in a much shorter time. But it's at this time where we enter the second phase, which is rising action. And so by rising action, I mean it happens in increasing frequency. So you find these challenges arising more and more frequently, sort of building the tension. And as I suggested a moment ago, sometimes those goals can change. So Dorothy has gone somewhere over the rainbow. She's going to meet some magical characters, and she's going to discover quickly that she has a new goal. She wants to get home, because Oz isn't just color and munchkins, it's also wicked witches and flying monkeys. And so in the process of trying to get back home, she is going to go up that ladder of rising action. And so this will reach the point where the antagonist and the protagonist, have to face each other off in the climax, which will be our third section. So along the way, and this is true of a great number of classical Hollywood narratives, the protagonist is going to encounter those who are going to help her along the way, or him, and those who are going to hinder. And so these characters tend to be flatter than the main character, less fleshed out as fully formed individuals, more one-dimensional, I suppose it would be another way to say it. But they become an important part of the quest that the hero goes on. So, as we said, Dorothy has landed in Oz, and she is soon greeted by the Munchkins. So far, so good. But she discovers that she has also landed her house. Of course, she wasn't driving, but that's where it landed, on the Wicked Witch of the South? I can't remember. And in the process has killed her, which makes the Wicked Witch of the East very angry indeed. And she, in fact, yearns for the ruby red slippers, but finds that she can't take them. And there is an intervention by Glinda, another witch, but this time not wicked. And so the two face off, and the Wicked Witch of the East decides to leave, and Dorothy does too, but she doesn't know how to do that exactly. So the Munchkins point the way. Follow the yellow brick road. And so off she goes. And this happens relatively quickly. She heads off, and in a series of like 3 shots, she arrives at a point where you don't know which part of the road to follow. You can go left or right. So she's literally reached a crossroads, and she's also met one of the 3 helpers, in this case the Scarecrow, who's not much help because he doesn't have a brain, and so he's giving instructions that aren't particularly useful. She'll later meet the Tin Man and, of course, finally the Cowardly Lion. And each of these have minor obstacles that they present Dorothy with. So, for example, the Scarecrow needs to get off of his stake, learn how to walk. The Tin Man is rusted, and so they have to oil him to get him moving. And the Cowardly Lion has to be infused with courage so that he can continue on with the quest with Dorothy, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow. So these are minor obstacles, and as I said, they each introduce not only obstacles but goals as well. The Scarecrow wants a brain, the Tin Man wants a heart, and the Cowardly Lion wants courage. So the more significant obstacles that Dorothy encounters will come in the form of things like trees that throw apples, mean-looking things, flying monkeys that are sent by the score by the Wicked Witch, later poppies as they get closer to Oz, which puts them to sleep, and so on. So these obstacles, again, kind of become more and more intense, and it seems put more at risk this goal that Dorothy has of getting back home. It'll never happen. But she arrives at Oz and actually gets to meet the wizard, who in the first form looks pretty intimidating. He's this kind of motion picture projected against this cathedral-like background with these flames exploding and so forth. And he gives the 4 travelers, Dorothy and crew, another task, and this is going to result in the climax, and that is to kill the Wicked Witch of the East, and to demonstrate that she's done that by taking her broom. And so we're reaching the point where we're going to have the climax, and this is the main turning point of the story. So most of the narrative has consisted of the second part, not the middle, but the rising action. And so the climax will usually be a pretty good chunk of time, too. It needs some setup. And in the case of the Wizard of Oz, for example, we already know that the witch is dangerous. She can shoot fireballs and can fly, has these creatures at her disposal. And we learn, too, that she lives in this really formidable castle, which is heavily guarded, not only with flying monkeys, but with the soldiers that are at the gates. But Dorothy and the crew are able to infiltrate, and the witch throws a fireball at the Scarecrow, and Dorothy, in trying to put out the fire, gets a bucket of water and throws it on the Scarecrow, missing and hitting the witch, who starts to melt, and she has defeated the Wicked Witch of the East without having to do any nasty action. It was the action that she did, it was true to herself in terms of being a kind person who wouldn't harm anybody, including the Wicked Witch, right? So we've reached the point then where we move into falling action. And I apologize for this. Let me get this up a little bit more. So falling action is after the point of the climax, and things start to kind of shake out in terms of the climax. So in the case of the witch being dead now, rewards are due, so the Tin Man gets his heart. The Scarecrow and the wizard gives them all something, gets a diploma and therefore a brain, and the Lion is given courage. And so the main reward, of course, is the one that's driven this whole narrative, and that is to get Dorothy back home. And so the wizard, the great wizard, puts on this great display, has a balloon, and everybody is going to cheer on this great leaving. But then Toto jumps out again, just like he did from Mrs. Gulch's basket. But Glinda appears, thankfully, and tells Dorothy that all along she's had the means to get back home, which are the ruby slippers. And so she clicks them 3 times, saying there's no place like home. And that's exactly now where we end, with the resolution. And so Dorothy wakes up and finds herself in bed. Maybe this was all a dream. And she finds herself also in black and white. And so maybe this ending isn't quite so happy, but the desolate background is still very much in evidence. The broken glass from the tornado. They're still in poverty. She's still living with elderly aunts and uncles and by herself, basically. But then we're reminded that everybody in the film was represented by its double in Dorothy's dream. And so even Professor Marvel, the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man also appear, and Dorothy realizes that there is in fact no place like home. Even if the film were to go on maybe another half an hour, it would look pretty grim again. So, but we end before that can happen. And so that's basically the classical Hollywood narrative, and I think it would be interesting for you to give that a shot. In other words, to take a film that you're familiar with and which follows this format and try to apply this formula using specifically this grid. Might want to go back to Freytag's, flesh it out, look at the textbook a bit more, but to use this model to analyze a film of your choice. So there's one more thing that I want to talk about, and that is plot and story. And sometimes these terms are used synonymously, as though they're the same. But I want to use plot very specifically to mean how we order and select items of the story and present them. So what we've seen with The Wizard of Oz has been pretty much chronological order. We begin in Kansas and we end in Kansas, and the time goes chronologically, like the clock would. Now, we do have ellipses, and what ellipses do is cut out things that don't seem necessary for the story. So just again, to go back to Dorothy's journey down the yellow brick road, we see her begin the journey, we see her turn and wave to the Munchkins, but then the very next shot is her arriving finally at the Scarecrow and the crossroads. So something's been cut out. That time, we don't know how long it took her to get here, but something's been cut out. But in any case, chronological, just as we live time from point A to point B. But that, of course, isn't the only way to tell a story. Where do you begin is a question that all filmmakers ask themselves. And sometimes, and this goes along with a quote from the great French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard, who said, every film's got to have a beginning, middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And so oftentimes films will employ non-chronological elements into it, even a classical Hollywood narrative. They might be flashbacks, flash forwards, beginning in medias res, which is basically in the middle. And so I'm thinking of, for example, movies like Sunset Boulevard, which begins with this image very close to the beginning. We hear a voiceover first, and he's talking about Hollywood. But we meet him, he's dead. He's floating on a pool. And he's saying, "You're probably wondering how I got here." And so the whole rest of the film is going to be a flashback. And there are other films that do a similar trick. I'm thinking of American Beauty. I'm thinking of Fight Club. I'm thinking of Inception, which really messes with time. One of the more interesting ones is Pulp Fiction, which begins kind of at the end, but not really if you think about it. The narrative and the plot and the story are really very different because the character played by John Travolta is alive in the cafe at the beginning. We don't see him yet. And when we return to this scene, at the end, he's alive as well. But of course, he's been shot and killed before. This happens in the way it's been plotted. In other words, his murder happened somewhere about the middle of the film. So people have it's really quite complicated. People have posted and constructed these really elaborate plot designs. You can check this out online, Pulp Fiction, in chronological order, what would happen first. And it's really hard to keep track of. There are flashbacks or interlapping stories. It's really very interesting what it does with time. And so this is an example of a non-classical narrative. And one thing that happens is that the characters are really pretty complicated. And so with this chart on the left, you can see that Vincent and can become either the hero or the antagonist, depending upon which scenario you're in. And so it's really not quite as simple as a classical Hollywood narrative. And a lot of films are kind of now structured on this model, even if most of the blockbuster films that we're seeing are still a classical Hollywood narrative. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you're well, and please email me if you have any questions. I'll be back to you soon.